All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm James Horvath, and your 2021 president for AIA Las Vegas chapter. Tonight's presentation is put together by the Disaster Preparedness Committee. But before we get to some of the business in the meeting, as well as the introduction of the chair of the committee, I did want to introduce Phil Ralston. Many of you should recognize Phil, and I'd like to ask him to speak a few words about St. Baldrick's and the Bald by Design team. Phil? You're muted.
Thank you. All right. Hey, there you go. Thanks, James. Thanks, everybody. I want to start by thanking the chapter for the continued support of the Bald by Design team. And you've been our official team sponsor for probably a decade or a little more. We are coming out of this pandemic. It's been a challenging time for the St. Baldrick's Foundation. Like so many charities, we've suffered because of that downtime, and St. Baldrick's in particular has suffered because most of our fundraising is done through in-person events. Well, we're coming out of it. We've now got our McMullen's Irish Pub event is now rescheduled for September 18th. And the team is back in gear. We've got 17 members so far, many of them from the AIA chapter. Jennifer Turchin has in fact already shaved her head via a virtual event that she did on her Facebook page. Look her up. You can donate through that. Other members that you probably know, Wyndham Kimsey, Mark, and Bill Snyder. There's a couple of others. I'm blanking on the names right now, but we've already raised just under 30,000 this year. If we can raise 84,000, our team history will hit $1 million. We'd really like to achieve that. So I'm making a special ask this year that people dig deep, consider bigger contributions than they might normally have done. Find your AIA team member and contribute to them. You can find all of them on the stbaldricks.org website. Just search by name and you'll be able to find them. And we're really thankful for the support that the chapter has given us. And we look forward to the continued support. Come out on the 18th. It'll be 5 or 6 p.m. That'll get published by Kelly once we know the firm times. But come out and have a blast. It's going to be a good, re-energized event after so much downtime. Thanks, James. I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Phil. It really has been a great success in the past. I know AIA Las Vegas and this community has been really a great support, and we look forward to this year, and we look forward to hopefully achieving that 84,000. I know $1 million is such a great accomplishment, and obviously there's more to that every year afterwards. So thank you very much, Phil, for your time tonight. So
thanks, James, and AIA.
Thank you. Tonight's membership meeting is brought to us through the sponsorship of our 2021 visionary sponsors. Those are Knit Studios, Nevada Sales Agency, the Penta Building Group, and Clyde Jubal Walls, as well as our platinum sponsors, Harris Consulting Engineers, TJK Consulting Engineers, Bergman Walls and Associates, and Grand Canyon Development Partners. With that, I want to introduce the Disaster Preparedness Committee. Their purpose from AIA Las Vegas is to prepare for and respond to local and statewide circumstances in which architects can provide assistance, aid, or save communities, to work with state and local officials to provide assistance through organized and collaborative efforts. At this time, I'd like to introduce the chair of the Las Vegas Committee, Troy Mosier, who will introduce tonight's presenter. Troy?
Thanks, James. It's my pleasure to be here tonight, and I'm excited about the opportunity to bring you some information about disaster preparedness and disaster assistance, with the hopes that some of you will get interested and excited about this, like the rest of our committee has, and with the hopes that you'll gain some knowledge, some information about what it is that the AIA envisions that we would do in terms of disaster assistance I'm a newbie at this. I'm learning as we go. So it's really exciting to meet folks like Bill Melby that can help us learn along the way and help us get our feet underneath us as a committee and as a chapter. We're kind of leading the way for the state too. So our Las Vegas chapter, the groundwork that we lay will lead the state component in terms of disaster assistance and preparedness as well. So with that, I'd like to briefly introduce Bill. Bill Melby, FAIA, is a recently retired principal of Ortiz Melby Architects in Bakersfield, California. Bill's been the principal in charge of over 300 diverse educational and institutional projects, including 4 major comprehensive high schools, numerous elementary school campuses, and several large master plans. Bill's been selected by his peers to serve his profession on numerous boards and committees of the American Institute of Architects at the local, state, and national level. Helping others through disaster assistance work is very important to Bill. He's been certified as a California OES SAP volunteer since 1993. He deployed to Northridge after their earthquake and to New Orleans in response to Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. He led the Ortiz Melby Architects team in the efforts to quickly reopen Sierra Sands Unified School District schools after the recent Ridgecrest earthquake. Bill served AIA California as their first Disaster Assistance Network chairperson and is the current chair of the AIA California Disaster Response Network, which oversees the development and updating of materials and training needed by chapters to respond to both the response and recovery phases of a disaster. This includes providing training for SAP volunteers, the updating of AIA California's Disaster Response Toolkit and Disaster Response Box. He also serves on the National AIA Disaster Assistance Committee, working on updating the soon-to-be-released Disaster Assistance Handbook version 4 and other tools to assist AIA components in their disaster assistance effort. Bill is a licensed architect in Nevada and California, and he's a graduate of Cal Poly State, San Luis Obispo, and holds a LEED AP certification as well as has his NCARB certification. So with that, welcome, Bill. Thanks again for joining us and taking some time out of your not so relaxed recently retired schedule. You know, I thought maybe we'd start tonight just by letting everybody know that we want this to be informal. I know that, you know, not everybody has a live mic right away. We'll do obviously some Q&A at the end, but throughout the program, if you have questions, if you want to raise your hand and join the conversation, or if you'd like to type it into the chat, we'll keep an eye on the chat line and try to answer those questions as we work through the program tonight. So, Bill, I thought maybe we'd start with a discussion about the difference between disaster preparedness or resilience, as it's maybe more commonly referred to now, and disaster assistance.
Yes, the disaster assistance, you know what, let me share my screen real fast here and go to the next slide should be. FEMA has a disaster assistance site or disaster cycle. And I'm going to throw a lot of different pieces of information towards you. I hope you can weed it out for your own particular uses. But the cycle is just that. It's a cycle. There's a disaster. We respond to the disaster. We learn from the disaster. And from that learning, we prepare for the next disaster. And as you can see from the bottom cycle, that's the classic FEMA disaster cycle graph. But the disaster assistance is basically the response phase. People are hurting. their lives have been turned upside down. They don't know if their buildings are something they can go back into safely. And disaster assistance volunteers are the ones that go and help in that respect. After the response, there's a recovery phase where people build very, very quickly. They try to build back, they repair their facilities. After that, we have a little time to look back and say, okay, what went wrong? What can we do better next time? And that's really the resilience phase. What can we do better next time? And what can we do initially to buildings so that they don't fail, or so that they do respond appropriately to disasters? And what's important to learn about resilience is when you build to code, you build to code. The code is meant to give you enough time to get out of the building safely. It's not there to make sure you can go back in tomorrow and reopen the building or reopen your business. So codes are typically life safety kind of documents that only go so far. And resilience is, what can we do that's just a little better to make sure that we don't have the issues with in a disaster when it does appear. Now, there's also
better than code then in terms of the resilience and what we learn from.
Exactly. And in fact, if and I'm going to shoot through these very quickly, and there we go. FEMA has done some research, and they've found that dollars initially invested in preparation or resilience have a payback, not necessarily to the owner as much, but to the owner and society of, in earthquakes, 4 to 1, and in urban wildfires, roughly 4 to 1. So money invested in resilience does have a payback, some to the owner or occupier and some to society at large. And the society at large costs are, your first responders and those sort of things that the government has to provide when an emergency strikes and you need help.
Got it. So, we've talked in our own committee meetings about FEMA and their role. It seems to me that what we try to do as AIA members would certainly not be to replace anybody else in what they do in disaster situations, but to help where we can.
Exactly. And what you'll find in the response thing, and let me go to the response. Of course, I put it in a different order. Anyway, what happens in a response is all disasters are local. And so the local persons respond first, the local agencies respond first. And if they can't handle it, they go upstream and they'll go to the next jurisdiction, which might be city to county, county to state, state to federal, which is FEMA. There's also what's called mutual aid. And if a state or a county is overwhelmed, then the mutual aid, they will ask for mutual aid. That's how I ended up in Louisiana after Katrina and Rita. The Louisiana folks, the cities, the parish, and the state were in fact overwhelmed and asked California for help, and California sent a team to do just that, to help them out.
So in a situation like ours, where we may have, the sort of the beginnings of a group that might be interested in making ourselves available to help, how do we how do we connect with the people that would call on us?
Okay. The first thing, the AIA has lots of resources, published resources, people like me who can help you out. The relationships are an incredible thing. If you have relationship with your local emergency management people, that's great. I can tell you when an emergency hits and the local emergency people are overwhelmed, the last thing they want to hear from is an architect who they believe is an ambulance chaser. You know, you're coming in here with the business card. That's not the case. And in fact, the structures are quite, there are a lot of structures that stop that from happening. Once they've experienced what architects can bring to the party, both in disaster assistance and in resilience, we get invited. You know, that they know that we can bring expertise that they don't have. And that's a really exciting thing. But there are, the AIA has an abundance of publications that discuss how you can set it up. In fact, that I do think I can find very quickly. There it is. This is the PDF that you can find on the AIA's website that briefly discusses the steps to set up a committee, basically get volunteers, decide who the point people are, you know, coordinate, connect and train, and think long term. The training we haven't really talked about, and that is probably something I do need to bring up with you. California was the first state to really get involved in disaster assistance and non-government volunteers. And so California, I say we, California set up a system where the state runs the entire system. They, for a lack of a better word, contract or work with the AIA and the engineer societies and the building inspector societies to let them work out the training, sponsor the training, keep the volunteers rosters current, and but they actually run the system. And at some point, we really need to talk about the legal part of that as well. But the call outs come from the state here. Other states, and it may be the way that you need to go, have what are called MOUs, or memoranda of understanding. And you do want to make sure that your state, I think you're probably better off at the state level if you can get some sort of an MOU or Good Samaritan law in place. And I do have I think it's the other way. There we go. This graphic shows the legal protections by state. And you can see that the red states have liability protection in place, and the white states have no liability protection. So if you help out as a volunteer pro bono, you're not charging a thing, you're just a great guy, and the person that you help decides to sue you, you have no Good Samaritan protection in Nevada at this time. So that is generally one of the first things that a committee that's forming from scratch will try to resolve. And there are lots of resources that AIA National has, including sample template MOUs. And there are several states that just recently got MOUs through their legislatures. And a gentleman named Tim Ah is is very good at that, and I can certainly put you in touch with him. And like I say, that's something, if you're going to do this seriously, you really need to consider and do, just for the protection of the volunteers.
Are we likely to have more success if we get some of the state agencies on our side and wanting our help in terms of getting an MOU or a Good Samaritan law in place?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's, you know, it's politics, and the more people, the more powerful people you have on your side, the better off you will be. Honestly, I don't think you're going to run up against a whole lot of political opposition. You know, some of the building owner groups may have an issue. Some of the attorneys groups may have an issue because they wouldn't be able to sue you, you know, after this happens. But generally, they're received fairly well. But you have to be, you know, you have to spell out that you're not ambulance chasers, that it is a public service, and that your volunteers are going in somewhat anonymous.
If I can
Yeah.
kind of jump in there, Troy, you know, and Bill, you know, I think for AIA Las Vegas, this is definitely, I think this is our second year, maybe third year of just our committee, and this obviously has been a new initiative that has come down from national to all of the chapters. You know, understanding, Bill, with California, they were probably one of the leaders in this movement and starting these committees. When was the time frame of California's initiation, and kind of walk us through, I guess, that process? Because for us in Las Vegas, I know Troy's been diligent on getting this committee moving and trying to find its footing and stuff. And I know there's other people out there that are interested. It's just we're trying to find our role and how we kind of go about this.
Exactly, and I've just put up a slide that shows California's history, and as you can see, it started in 1943, and that's older than even an old guy like me. So it's not something that just happened in the last few years. It actually started as a state war council during World War II to be able to assess damage and repairs from what they thought would be war issues. It changed, and as you can see, in 1970 to the Office of Emergency Services. In 1972, the AIA formally recognized the role of architects in disaster assistance. But you can see it took till 1978 for FEMA to even be created. So it's not something that goes, it's been here for a long time, but it is relatively new. We really got our start after the Loma Prieta earthquake, and some of us older guys remember that was the first time people saw earthquakes live on TV because they were watching the World Series. And so then it really hit its stride in the Northridge earthquake. My understanding was there were over 300 SAP volunteers, and SAP is an acronym for Safe Assessment Professionals. And and then after that, Katrina is where we really started going state to state. And you can see in 2006, the AIA realized that, wait a minute, if we're going state to state, we need to have a more nationwide training program. And so all of the training at this point, all the certification at this point comes from California still. So if you were to take the training, you would end up going to a Cal OES 6-hour training session where you would learn all about the entire program. And then if you were to go to an AIA training session, you would get the same 6-hour Cal training, plus you get 45 minutes more of non-California specific disasters, particularly hurricanes and tornadoes. And that would put you on a larger database of potential areas to respond. I was thinking about this as I was preparing. These things tend to, staff volunteers generally aren't called until the issue is a big one. Smaller issues are handled by local building departments. If they need more, they get surrounding community building departments. It isn't till all those departments are sort of overwhelmed that they start looking for volunteers. I think California sent something like 5 people to the Paradise fires. I think I believe we sent 12 to the Napa earthquake. We had about 300 in Northridge. So that's where the issues come. And quite frankly, the way the system is set up or intended to set up is, and use Nevada as an example, if there's a big disaster in Reno, the SAP volunteers should come from Las Vegas. If there's an issue in Las Vegas, the SAP volunteers should come from Reno and potentially California. When there's a disaster and your office is in the middle of that disaster and your home and family is in the middle of that disaster, you have other things to worry about. And the thought is bring in people from a distance away, and they aren't going to be ambulance chasing because they don't have an office in that city, or they may not. And it's a good sell, and it works well when it's done right.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting distinction, that it's that really you're most likely to be deployed to somewhere other than our local or regional area if you're interested in becoming a volunteer.
Exactly. And you may put on your radar screen, it used to be the Great California Shakeout, now it's just the Great Shakeout, but it is an annual emergency drill that happens every October. And it's got its own organization and a website, and they are their normal event is an 8.0 along the San Andreas Fault, somewhere around the Salton Sea. And if that happens the way, and it's engineered to be bad. I mean, it's engineered to be real bad. If that happens, there's severe damage in LA and San Diego. And I guarantee you, if that happens and you have responders, you will be called.
So, I think you're going to do a little bit of case study and show us some of your deployment experience a little bit later. But I think the training that we're talking about right now, and the magnitude of a disaster that you could be deployed to, could be a little bit overwhelming, a little scary. But when you and I were talking a couple weeks ago, you pointed out to me that really the SAP training is just kind of an introduction, and when you do get deployed, you're almost 100% likely to be trained again when you get there to know more specifically what it is that you're being asked to do and look for.
Yes, kind of. Yeah, the SAP training is basic training for all events, all disasters. When you get to the location, each specific disaster has its own specific needs, if you will, and its own. One of the things that we probably need to talk about, we talked about the legal issues. When you are in an area as a volunteer, the normal practice is you are deputized. So you actually become a deputy of some government agency, whether it's the building department or the sheriff or the fire department. And you become a legal poster of placards. And this is a sample of the placards that you would post. And the green is basically, it's okay. We've looked at it, there's some damage, but it's safe to reoccupy as it is. A yellow placard is just like a stoplight. It's a caution. Usually yellow placards are area specific. In a home, for instance, if the chimney is leaning dangerously over a family room, that yellow may be, you can go back in, but you can't go in the family room. You can go in, one person can go in and retrieve your valuables or your clothing or whatever you need, but only one at a time, and for limited periods of time. So the yellow has a lot of opportunities for discretion on the volunteers. The red, if you are in fact deputized, that says entry into this building is illegal. If you go in, you can be arrested and prosecuted for that. We don't see an awful lot of red tags. Typically, by the time they get to that point, the building, so much of the building is gone. There's no doubt you wouldn't want to go in, but it does happen. And the places where it happens most are where buildings are off their foundation, and they look pretty, they look pretty good to the average person because they're still intact, but there's no place for the loads to go. And so that's a place where you do see a red tag. It's not quite so apparent. Now you talked about further training. We do typically have what I would call a standardization visit when we start a deployment, where all of the teams, typically the teams go out in pairs, and the pairs are for safety reasons. One person will usually go around the building, onto the property, occasionally into a building if they believe it's safe. If at any time you do not believe it's safe, you do not go in or you do not go near. And they'll teach you that in the training. Anyway, those are the teams of two. So if you have a deployment of 25 or 50 people, you want them all to be seeing things roughly the same way. So often your coordinator will bring you to a building, and everybody gets a chance to evaluate that same building. And the question becomes: is this a yellow tag or is this a red? What would you do here? So it's not necessarily more training. It's more establishing a standard that we all agree upon.
And what do you, like, these teams of people, are these all made up of architects, or are these made up of different professionals in the same, I would say, same industry? Are they part of the construction industry or engineering or building department that make up these volunteers? And
the answer is yes to all. Typically, you must be a building official or a licensed professional. So you won't see somebody, there is I guess there's an exception to that for, in California anyway, for certified building inspectors. And in California, we have an organization called DSA, which is Division of the State Architect. And DSA inspectors and schools and OSHPD, or Office of Statewide Health Planning and Design, those inspectors inspect hospitals. They're highly trained inspectors and they've passed exams. And so they don't have an engineer or an architect title, but the state of California recognizes them as having passed the minimum standards of experience and knowledge that's needed. Everybody else is either a civil, a structural engineer, civil engineer, or architect, and they must be licensed. And all of us, no matter what category, must have the 6-hour training. And they must be renewed, I believe it's every 5 years. And when they do, they'll give you a little card, looks like that. And typically those are worn around your neck when you go out in the field so that they know you're official. But I can tell you on sort of a humorous note, you put on a hard hat, a vest, and work boots, and you can walk just about anywhere in a disaster. You get a lot of latitude.
Kind of a follow-up question to the deployment and the Good Samaritan law, and considering that volunteers from our chapter, for example, once we get established, would be most likely to be deployed elsewhere. Would the Good Samaritan law in the state of the disaster be applicable to the volunteer regardless of where they're from?
Well, I tell my clients never take legal advice from an architect. It's the wrong license. And I stand by that. I don't want to tell you would never be deployed in Nevada, but I've got a couple of slides that I think you'll find comforting. And to go back to your original question, it would depend on the Good Samaritan law that was adopted by the state. So you may be covered in Idaho, but not in California, or New Hampshire and not in Florida. You'd have to check, and that would be something that I would hope you as a committee would be able to do fairly quickly if deployed. Now, I can tell you if we're deployed through Cal OES, they have already done that research because they cover us. You may be able to build that into your MOU. But I tried to gather slides that would let you know sort of where you are in the disaster food chain, if you will. You can see California's in 2020, California was on fire. Oregon was on fire. Nevada looks pretty clean. And then if you go back, this slide was mainly to show you that there really is a disaster season. It really doesn't fit in this conversation, but I think you'd find it interesting. From about now on is where you're going to see the hurricanes, fires, and other disasters. And until I got really involved in this, I wouldn't have believed this, but it's true. So climate disasters, you can see, again, you're in the light numbers, your state's pretty safe. If you look at mean temperature departures, if you're looking at climate change and where are you going, it does look a little bit more like you're part of California in that one, in that the predicted climate rises in climate should hit you as well. And living in Bakersfield, it's almost as hot as Las Vegas. That's something I'm not looking forward to, and I suspect you aren't either.
Yeah, it's been hot here, and I know Troy, we've been feeling it for sure recently.
So there is a website. I went back today to see if I could put the website link on this, and of course I couldn't find it. So, but I will find it, and so you can see. But I believe this is a FEMA site, and it does show the disasters since 1953 that and where they occurred. So you can see, the Carson City, Reno, east of the Sierras is your most likely place for a disaster. You look down in the Vegas area, and you know there's some potential there. If you look over to the right, you can see the names of the disasters, and these are only declared disasters. So, and you can see the one that's highlighted is pandemic. You know, that's something that a resilience committee might be thinking about is, you know, how do we build a building that's as resilient as it can be to a pandemic? It's not something you're going to send SAP volunteers for, of course. And then you can see down below the frequency of disasters. And, you know, no matter what your political views or what your climate change views are, for some reason that we won't attribute, disasters seem to be more frequent, growing more frequent. And it may be just that we're better at cataloging them and declaring them, but they are more frequent. But I think the good news is Nevada, you're in pretty good shape. This is where I mentioned before the payback, you know, the floods, the 5 to 1, 7 to 1. And if you look, you know, then you're still in pretty good shape. You know, I think that's one of the reasons that you have been able to go this long without a disaster assistance committee, is because you're a pretty safe place.
And I guess for my edifications and just understanding, I mean, is the disaster, what quantifies disasters? Is it when it's based upon, you know, the state or federal declaring it? Is that what triggers it, or?
I believe these are all federal, although I wouldn't swear to it. But somebody somewhere declared an emergency, and it very well could be state. But there's a list, and when I give you the link, you'll be able to go in and go all the way back to 1953 and see what all the disasters were.
Speaking of, you know, the COVID, obviously as being part of the disaster, what have you seen from California in terms of architecture and AIA, and what involvement has been on that side, or what has your committee been doing in California?
Now, my committee is disaster assistance rather than resilience. Okay. So although I just got voluntold that I'm going to be on the resilience committee, and I'm happy to do that, but at this point, the resilience committee really hasn't dealt with that. I would gladly share whatever information we derive, but at this point, we don't have it.
Okay.
Okay. I think you've asked good questions. I think you covered most of it. Yeah, that we've talked about almost all the things on my list. If you would like, you know, that I can give you a deployment, a little slideshow on what a deployment looks like. If you have any questions before that, I'd love to answer them if I can.
I'm not seeing anything else in the chat.
Yeah.
Okay.
Either.
All right.
Yeah, I think it'd be good to see the deployment and kind of walk through that process. So if there's anyone that's interested in that, we can kind of get involved.
Sure. Let me share the screen again. And okay, this was October of 2005. It was actually 3 months after Katrina hit. It took them that long to basically drain out the basin and make it safe enough for us to be there. And even that's something we probably will talk about later. This is the actual verbiage for the deployments and the SAP itself. You can see there are two different kinds of SAP volunteers that deploy. One of them is an evaluator, and that's what we've been talking about. And the other is a coordinator. Coordinators are usually government officials. I was a coordinator for a little while, never got deployed as a coordinator. So it doesn't you don't have to be a government official, but they typically are. You asked earlier about the agencies that went. You can see that construction inspectors, AIA, this was structural engineers, civil engineers, and building officials like we talked about before. So we got the call. You don't know what you're really up against. You pack your bags of stuff that you need to live, and you bring what's called the go bag. And typically the go bag has the things that you would take into the field. Clipboards. When in an earthquake, we often have a plumb bob or a level. I bring a little compass, not because it's helpful in the building, but it's helpful in the report. It's often disorienting. You know, the north side of the building, you know, which side of the building's north? Sometimes you just don't know. So you take those things. This was a unique deployment because that's the only one I've ever been on where the government got us a plane. And an interesting side story is I was actually watching a documentary on the development of the stealth bomber, and the employees that went to work from LA every day to the stealth bomber factory boarded a plane called Casino Express. Well, lo and behold, Casino Express showed up to take us to New Orleans. So I felt sort of like James Bond for a few days. And quite honestly, there were 26, 27 of us. When we got there, about halfway through the deployment, they said, well, you know what, there weren't really enough to justify the plane. You guys find your own way home, we'll reimburse you. That was not the best way to go. It was, quite frankly, not the best for morale, but in a disaster, things happen, you know. So anyway, this is where our first stop was in Baton Rouge, and we were able to spend the night there. We got in the midday. The main reason for stopping in Baton Rouge was injections, vaccines, tetanus shots, that sort of thing. You don't see that in an earthquake, you don't see that in a fire, but when you see a flood with all the potential ugliness that comes from a flood, they want to make sure the volunteers are protected against the kind of things that grow in that ugly water. Come on, my finger's just too fast. We went out, got the supplies we thought we would need. Until you really get there, you don't know. So we got a lot of the supplies, and one of the supplies we got, since it was in October and the World Series was on, somebody bought a portable TV. So, you know, some of those things are just necessary for deployment. Our initial briefing was on a cruise ship because the buildings weren't capable of giving us a briefing. We were on a cruise ship. The two gentlemen that are standing there, actually that's the back of my head. The larger gentleman was the building official for the St. Bernard. his first comment to us was, I know exactly what to do because it's in the manual. The manual's on my shelf in my office. My office was under 13 feet of water. So now I know absolutely nothing about what we need to do. It's on you. The other gentleman was a gentleman who, my understanding, was a colonel in the Marine Corps who took a leave of absence, apparently, to do this. And I think the Marine Corps asked him to. And he coordinated the FEMA and a lot of the response efforts. There are a lot of agencies that deal with disasters, and a Marine Corps colonel is a great way to keep them all organized. I guarantee it. That is the public building that the building official would have been in. So as you can see, don't expect a lot of, that they're going to try. Now that things are on the web, they're probably going to have a better clue of what's going on, but they are going to be in a state of shock. And so you have to be able to sort of work independently. When we got to St. Bernard, these were our living accommodations. You can see a large row of cots. Back in the corner, right back here, you can see a screened off area. The female volunteers had their cots and their and other facilities back in there. Most of the volunteers were male, and we were out here. You can see initially, porta potties are typically what you see the first day. The the yellow tent-like structure, that's a decontamination shower. And that was occasionally used for decontamination, but basically it's a portable shower. So they could deploy it, and that's how we took our showers, just normal showers. The blue bladders out on the ground, those are bladders of water. There was a gentleman with a very high intensity Insta-Hot water heater, and he would watch a valve, and as the heat went down, you'd hear, and that they would fire up that gas, and the showers the warm water got hotter pretty fast. And then the toilets got much nicer as time went by. And in fact, within a few days, we had a laundry service. They brought in a trailer. At the end of the day, you could bring your soiled clothes in. They would launder them, fold them, and have them ready for you when you got back from your deployment. And that was luxury. I mean, that doesn't happen much. I can tell you in California, often the first day, at Northridge, for instance, we slept in sleeping bags on the ground. We actually slept in sleeping bags on the cots here when we brought the bags. But we went out for our first deployment. When we came back, there was a tent city that looked a lot like this, although there weren't cots. So we slept on sleeping bags on the ground in a nice tent. All the time, the CAL FIRE in California, they fed us very well. Firefighters, I found out, eat very well, and it's substantial food. So the one thing I can say from disaster to disaster to disaster, they feed you well. And in fact, this is the mess hall, or the mess tent. You can see it was a buffet. They actually brought the caterer in from Florida, and she specializes in doing disaster catering for volunteers. And you can see one of the tents right next to us was National Guard, and they were our neighbors there the whole time, and nice guys. The other groups on the scene, the you can see the fire truck. They came from all over the country. Medical services, again, doctors, nurses volunteered from all over the country. The medical services did a great job with blisters, and there were a lot of blisters. You do a lot of walking on some unstable stuff, and anything that was an issue, they could take care of right there. There's the Blue Tarp group, and honestly, I wish I knew their names. They're amazing. If you haven't had any roof damage and the house was in pretty good shape, they'd be there with the roof tarps to keep you dry. Below that is vector control. And I talked about the stuff that grows after a flood. It was kind of eerie how silent things were. There weren't a lot of animals, well, there weren't any animals that I can recall, not even birds chirping. The vector control made sure that there weren't mosquitoes and illness transferring things. One of the things that was unique about the St. Bernard is St. Bernard basically walled itself off and put checkpoints. So even the residents weren't allowed back in. We were in before the residents. And to a certain extent, that was helpful because it's emotionally draining when you have to deal with residents all the time. And I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just when you see people whose life has been turned upside down in an instant, they really want to talk, and you really can't do anything but feel sorry for them, you know. And the problem is you've got a job to do. You know, your job is not counselor. We're not trained there. Your job is, can you get back into your house? So anyway, you can see National Guard. You can see the trash piled up in front of the houses. The residents were allowed in short periods of time so they could get all the stuff out of their house and put it out for the insurance inspectors. And that's basically what happened. The insurance adjusters would come by, look at all the stuff in the front yard, look at the damage to the house, and make an assessment. And then it's hard to see the green lettering on the side there is animal control. And they talked about if they found dead animals or if they found animals that were loose, they would deal with those. This is the crew. This is the entire crew. This is what we call Team 5. There was 4 of us, and this was our coordinator for the entire group. He spent most of his time coordinating with FEMA, the Sheriff's Department, the local building department, making sure the system worked well, and assigning us different areas that we would, or basically just telling us which houses we needed to inspect. An interesting side story about this is before all of the Google Maps and satellite, well, not before, but early on, satellite imagery. And we asked if they had any. The answer was no. We don't often take no as the answer right away. Our leader found that a water agency had actually used some of the GIS, made their own map. So he got a copy of that map, and we brought it out into the field, and the police and the fire said, "Where did you get that? We want one too." So, you know, that's the kind of, you know, we weren't withholding anything. It's just in the heat of battle, that's what happens. So, and you can see down here, there was a tally, 13 days, no injuries, 16,000 completed, 10,000 to go, which was quite fast, to tell you the truth. So
that's the number of structures you needed to go through, yeah?
Exactly. And some of them just plain weren't there. So they were real easy. They were very easy. This is our consistency review, and you can see our leader there talking about it. We had the building on one side. There was a single-story building. We had the 2-story in the back. I believe there was another building on the other side that we were doing as well. And the intent was that we would all be as close as we could to the same evaluation criteria, same grade, if you will. One of the things that happened there was, because there was a flood, structural guys normally don't look at this, but we looked at the electrical panels. The electrical panels that were flooded is an issue. So we noted the height of the flood water and whether it went over the panel. That actually led in a couple of days to us in one of our coordination meetings. We said, can't we do a keynote system for this? 9 of the 10 houses have an electrical panel underwater. So we did. We developed the keynote system, which sped up the reports quite a bit and helped us. And so it's an evolving thing. As you go, you try to learn and try to get better at it. And I think there was a question earlier about the teams, the 2-man teams going out, whether they are all architects. And I think I got sidetracked. I do that easily. I think the best team is a structural or a civil engineer and an architect. I go back to Northridge on that one. I was looking at a 3 condo in the Northridge area, and it just didn't look right. And it didn't look right to me, and it didn't look right to the engineer, but he couldn't quite figure out what the issue was. When I went over to one side of the building, I realized that there was a wall just smashed up or flush up against the planter. And I knew from seeing the detailing that planter probably had a 2-inch gap for air between the planter and the studs. Engineer didn't have a clue. That's not something he was trained with, but it was something I could pick up. On the other hand, there were structural things that he saw that I didn't see. So ideally, the diversity of the team is the best. You don't always have that option. So anyway, back to the show. This is the famous CNN backdrop. You saw it just about every night. It was real, and it was where we went. This I found really interesting. I told you that the area had checkpoints. This is one of the ways that they kept the checkpoints functioning. Any road that didn't go through a checkpoint, there was a smashed car wall that basically they walled in the parish area. Closer to the ocean, that's what we saw. And I'm hoping your screens are large enough to see what that is. It's basically a pile of wood. And it's a long, long pile of wood. These are the areas outside the levee. These are the areas that are out in the fishing villages and basically not in the urban core or urban area of New Orleans. The same with the photo just to the right. You can see there's a whole lot of buildings that were up on stilts. Wind blew them right off the stilts. So, there's only so much resilience you can build in, I guess. I would say that the stilts are probably still a good idea, but maybe fastening the building a little better to the stilts is something that we need to look at. And then this is fairly typical of the areas that they hadn't gotten to. You can see they sort of, for lack of a better word, snowplowed the street, but basically everything else was just, there was a lot of this in the areas before they got in with the debris removal equipment. And there were varying stages of this cleanup in the whole process. So what were we looking for? Again, electrical issues, racking, off foundation. Do you see what's wrong with that picture? It's a tougher one. Well, I won't keep you in suspense too long. There are two posts, or two knurled, look like headboard posts sticking between the top plate and the roof. Right here. Oh, let me go back. Right in here. So basically the roof had lifted, contents had flood contents had moved, and right in there, you can see it got caught between the roof and the wall. So some of the things you find, I didn't expect that, you know. I think you'll see in another slide, I didn't expect this either. This is a concrete slab building that was undermined, and undermined quite a bit. Nobody expects to find a Winnebago on their roof, but it happened quite a bit. Or, you know, not to that extent, but cars and heavy objects on the roof were quite common. And the concern was, particularly if there were exit doors, you know, going through it. You could have a house that was still structurally sound, but if you had to cross underneath the Winnebago to get out, that's certainly not a green tag. You know, depending on how many other exits there were, it might have been a yellow. It probably was a yellow, but there were other issues that we had to deal with too. And then the signs, power poles, you know, you just have to be really careful of where you are and where you're going. And those are hazards that we had to note as well, although they didn't have an address. This is, I call it goo. That's what was left after the water receded in areas where there was shadow or shade, usually in breezeways, things like that. You have to, you know, there is a certain, how do I put this? To be a volunteer and to go to a place like this, you have to be able to deal with the fact that there's unknown stuff in there. You know, that on an earthquake, generally it's not a problem. On a flood, it's a problem. You know, all the houses had sheds, brake fluid, a transmission fluid, antifreeze, insect repellent, you name it. It was in the shed. Shed got tipped over. Things got broken. It was in the water. It dried up here. So, and quite frankly, I wanted to applaud you for your support of the Baldrick Foundation. As a cancer patient myself, I want to say that I appreciate that, and it does go to a good cause. Some people have asked me, well, did you get it there? Heck, I don't know. I doubt it, but it's possible. You know, it's possible. And would I do it again? Yeah. You know, it was the right thing to do. So these were the sort of varying stages of drying of the goo, if you will. And if you notice, this thing is the background of the slide. And I did that intentionally because it was everywhere. It was the background of our experience. This is what we saw often inside. And we're not trained to do toxics. So we did our structural evaluations and sort of moved on. But there were other issues that people needed to deal with. And these are commercial. This is a school. They don't have the kind of reinforced masonry that we have out west. And my understanding is that was primarily water-driven furniture and equipment that smashed through that wall. This is a church where people would come for comfort the comforters needed comfort too. You can see the supermarkets and businesses, everybody gets hit. And this I find particularly heart-wrenching, if you will. We saw a lot of Civil War memorabilia that had been flooded and damaged. We saw a lot of photos and family memories that have been flooded, and honestly, until you see this, you don't think about it in your own life. But maybe we should, scan them, put them in the cloud, have them there in case something happens, because it happens in the blink of an eye. And I think if you talk to any of the people in the disaster assistance community, you're going to find out part of the driving force of this is it could have been me. But people do have a humor, and you can see the boat down below, for sale, 1 cent, will finance. You have to laugh your way through this. And the Wicked Witch, and you can see their legs sticking out from underneath that. So, now, the interesting thing is the 2 first institutions to reopen were churches and bars, and they opened relatively quickly under circumstances that they certainly wouldn't call ideal. But as I mentioned, people need comfort, and they take it in different ways, and bars and churches tried to help out, I guess. And then the last slide is New Orleans proper, and there was a pretty big difference. The city, St. Bernard was behind the levees and in much lower ground. In New Orleans, particularly in the French Quarter, in the old areas, they had to build high. They didn't have levees, so they were able to come back more quickly. But you can see even those, the partiers never stopped in New Orleans, even with a hurricane, and the vendors were outside, but they were getting it done. So that, I believe, is all I had for that. So any questions about that?
Well, there's a question in the chat, but before we go to that, I wanted to just, as a kind of a wrap up to your experience, and both in Baton Rouge or in New Orleans, in that area, and then in general, I guess where I'm headed is what drives you to be involved at this level? What's the most rewarding part of serving in the capacity of the disaster assistance group?
Well, as I mentioned, I think most people who are involved in this see it as it could have been me, or they feel an empathy for people who are in trouble, and through no fault of their own. They went to bed one night or went to work one day, and the next day their life had changed dramatically. And chances are it won't happen to you, but it could. And when you go out into the field and these things, you really realize how vulnerable you are and how vulnerable society in general is. And anything I can do to help, I want to do.
So going to the chats here, we have a question asking us to talk about joining AIA National's Disaster Assistance Committee by choosing a state disaster coordinator to liaison with that group for learning and support and more guidance.
Yes, the state disaster, or excuse me, the National Disaster Assistance Committee is a committee that is appointed by the board. I believe it's the board. It could be the president, but I believe it's the board. It's an incredible group. I have been, this year was my first year on it. I have been a state disaster coordinator that reported to that board for several years, but the committee itself is a very diverse group. We have an architect who works in the insurance industry for an insurance company. We have an architect who is a fire marshal in a major city. We have a lady who works for FEMA who is an architect. I believe there's even a member who's not an architect, but brings skills that we need or that makes our thing better. The committee itself is probably 10 to 12 people. Each state does have a disaster assistance coordinator. And I would, in fact, Troy, I suspect that whether you know it or not, you're probably it. I
believe so, yeah.
Back when, before COVID, we would meet once a year, usually in Washington, D.C., and get training, get, meet other disaster assistance coordinators, and really, really get the leaders as trained up as we can. So yeah, you definitely have that representation. If you or someone you know, particularly if they're an architect, has specific skills or a disaster experience, you can apply to be in the state disaster, or excuse me, the Disaster Assistance Committee. Honestly, those people are usually asked. I was. They look out and they see what expertise they need and what experience they have, and they tap me on the shoulder and said, you need to apply for this, and so I did, and it's a lot of work. I can tell you that. That manual was a lot of editing, reviewing, rereading, peer reviewing, but again, I think it's going to help you and other components, so it's well worth the effort.
Yeah, I have to say that when I sat in on the sort of the regional meeting that discussed the MOUs, learning that there were other folks in my shoes and then folks like yourself out there that were happy to be a resource was a big relief to me in both ways. So I think it's great that we can rely on each other to share experiences and see what's been done ahead of us and learn from that and build on it. So we'll look forward to asking you more questions in the future, Bill.
You know where to find me, Troy.
There is one more that's come in, basically just asking for, what was the general purpose of the inspections team as they were deployed? Seeing that, is it more for the insurance reasons? Is it safety, discovery? If in many cases things were just eventually and essentially being destroyed, what was the purpose for that team?
The purpose in general for SAP volunteers is to get people back into buildings as quickly as they can. I've got a great example that came from the Northridge earthquake. One of the structures I needed to evaluate was an apartment building, wood construction apartment building, gypsum interior, very flexible, performed incredibly well. But there were diagonal cracks at the windows. And so when we got there, what we saw was a row of tents back up against a block wall, because in fact, I believe all of the residents were Hispanic and were immigrants that were used to less safe buildings that were masonry buildings or adobe buildings in some cases. So when they saw a crack at a window, they weren't going in. And these were purely cosmetic cracks. And you know, as a design professional, you could see it instantly. So we went out to tell them, and I reached up and grabbed the top of this 6-foot wall, and I could move it a foot in either direction. It was an unreinforced concrete yard wall. And so in my best broken Spanish, I basically said, that's bueno no bueno, you know, this is okay, this is not. And I showed them the wall and they went, oh, okay, I get it. You know, so those people could go in, they all of a sudden, homeless people weren't homeless anymore. And that's really the whole challenge, is after something happens and it happens quickly, everybody moves outside. And how do you get them back into safe buildings and keep them out of unsafe buildings?
Well, great.
Well,
Thanks again, Bill, for your time tonight. We really appreciate you helping us get a little bit more familiar with what it is that we've been challenged to take on.
Fantastic. I hope I was helpful to you, and I am a resource you can reach out to. And I wish you the best of luck in this. Like I say, it's very good work, and I applaud you for doing it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both, Bill and Troy, really for tonight's presentation and everything that we went through. Just to kind of wrap up everything we've got tonight, I just want to remind everyone to, you know, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn, as we've been doing more and more updates on there on our social media platforms. Also, if you, on our screen is our Executive Director Carlos's email. If you have any additional questions, or if you're further interested in joining our Disaster Preparedness Committee, please feel free to reach out to him, and he will put you in touch with Troy and the rest of the committee. And with that, I just want to say again, thanks to everyone. Thank you for attending, and everyone have a great evening.